spring of 1945, the war in Europe was shuddering toward its brutal end, though few who marched through the ruined countryside were ready to admit it. German officers, once symbols of discipline and absolute authority, now traveled as prisoners. Their medals still clung to their uniforms, but the pride that once accompanied them had been scraped thin by retreat, hunger, and the collapse of everything they had been trained to uphold. These were men shaped by a doctrine that considered surrender a disgrace. Yet surrender had come regardless, not as a choice, but as a final inevitability at the end of a war waged far past reason. Among them was General Wilhelm Strelitz, a tall, sharp-boned man in his early 50s, whose silhouette once commanded attention in planning halls. He had led divisions across the plains of Eastern Europe, believing that strategy, order, and resolve could bend fate to his will. But the war had outgrown him, as it had nearly every German commander by its final year. He surrendered only when his remaining soldiers could no longer lift their rifles, when the last supply route vanished, and when ammunition was measured not in crates, but in handfuls. He surrendered because there was nothing left to command. Beside him in captivity was Colonel Ernst Volkmann of the Luftwaffe, a man whose gaze carried the distant heaviness of someone remembering a different sky. Once he had coordinated bomber groups that flew in precise formations across Europe. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was an echo of itself. Fuel was scarce, aircraft were grounded before takeoff, and the pilots assigned to new squadrons were teenagers taught more about loyalty than flight. His surrender came in silence when his airfield was surrounded. No final order. No last stand. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the war he had built his life upon had already collapsed. They were loaded onto ships with hundreds of other prisoners and ferried across the Atlantic. The journey was long, the holds crowded, but the conditions were orderly and structured. They expected anger when they arrived, perhaps curses thrown at them, perhaps judgment for the destruction their nation had inflicted. Yet from the moment they stepped onto American soil, the atmosphere was not one of triumph, but of administrative calm. Their captors were careful, watchful, but not vengeful. Trains carried them deep into the American interior, farther than any of them had imagined. From the windows, the land seemed impossibly wide, fields stretching unbroken to the horizon, skies unmarred by smoke. Strelitz watched the landscape pass in silence, thinking of the charred rail yards and blackened neighborhoods of his homeland. Volkmann murmured that he could not remember the last time he saw a horizon unclouded by ash. The contrast was not merely geographic. It was a contrast between a world exhausted by war and a world that had only observed it from a distance. The train stopped in Texas, where heat shimmered across open plains and the air carried the scent of dry earth. The camp they approached was enclosed by barbed wire and guarded towers. It was unquestionably a prison. Yet inside, the barracks were well constructed, the walkways swept, and the administration organized. The American guards issued instructions clearly and without insult. They did not strike the prisoners. They did not look at them with triumph. They looked at them simply as men who needed to be processed. That evening, the prisoners were fed. The meal consisted of broth with visible cuts of meat, potatoes, and bread that was soft rather than stale. For Strelitz, it was the first meal in months that did not feel like a calculation of survival. Volkmann stared at the bread as though trying to remember when such a thing had last been familiar. Others ate slowly, waiting for the ration to be taken away or halved. But the food remained, and the guards waited patiently for them to finish. Some officers refused to acknowledge the comfort. They sat with stiff backs and tightened jaws, insisting that any kindness was strategic manipulation. Yet even they could not ignore what they were seeing, a camp that adhered to rules, one where dignity had not been stripped away. Letters home would later describe these conditions with cautious phrasing, softened to avoid the suspicion of disloyalty. But even softened truth carried weight. That first night, Strelitz lay awake in his bunk, listening to the quiet rhythm of guard boots on gravel. He did not feel safe. He did not feel forgiven. What he felt was displacement. The principles he had believed in, duty, sacrifice, national destiny, felt unanchored here. The silence was not the aftermath of destruction. It was simply silence. Below him, Volkmann spoke softly. "If our people at home had half of what we were given today," he whispered, "the war could not have lasted this long." Strelitz closed his eyes. He did not answer. There was no argument to offer. Outside, the camp lights glowed steadily, outlining the wire in a pale halo. Beyond the fence lay cities untouched by ruin. Inside lay men who had been prepared to die for an ideal they no longer recognized in the living world. The realization did not come as revelation, but as a slow, unsettling shift. An awareness that loyalty built on fear and rhetoric could not withstand the evidence of the senses. Even the proudest officers felt it, a fracture small but undeniable in the worldview that had once seemed unshakable. Yet none of them would speak this aloud, not yet. To admit such a shift was to confront not only defeat, but the possibility that the war had been lost long before the final surrender. And as dawn approached now, one question settled into the quiet with the weight of truth. What happens when the enemy treats you better than the nation you fought to defend? Morning in the camp began not with shouting or chaos, but with the crisp sound of a bell carried across dry Texas air. The prisoners filed out of their barracks into sunlight that revealed everything plainly. No smoke, no rubble, only the unbroken stillness of prairie land. General Wilhelm Strelitz stood among them, his uniform now clean but unadorned, the metal insignia of rank removed. The barracks behind him were built of pine and neatly maintained, nothing like the makeshift shelters he had seen raised in desperate retreat. Across the yard, Colonel Ernst Volkmann watched a group of younger soldiers testing a soccer ball, tapping it between their boots as though their captivity were merely an extended training exercise. It was the first time in months he had seen men move with a hint of leisure. The simplicity of the scene felt disorienting, as though war had paused without explanation. Breakfast was served in a mess hall where long tables filled with rows of tin trays and steaming dishes waited. The portions were measured but generous. Eggs, potatoes, a slice of ham, and bread soft enough to tear without force. The men ate with a strange combination of hunger and caution, tasting rather than devouring as though expecting the food to vanish. Some whispered that the Americans were feeding them like livestock, to fatten them before cruelty began. But the days passed and the meals remained steady. Strelitz remembered the final weeks in Germany. Men scraping burnt flour from the bottoms of pans, boiling roots for soup, civilians lining up for rations that never arrived. Here, the soldiers could eat without calculation. Volkmann found himself finishing his meals entirely, though he did so with a quiet shame that he could not fully understand. Work assignments were structured around maintaining the campgrounds, repairing fences and tending small agricultural plots. The tasks were not designed to break the spirit. They seemed instead to preserve it. Men worked in teams, spoke among themselves, and even laughed. American guards observed from watchtowers, rifles slung casually, not drawn. Some guards were young, barely older than the German recruits who had been told to defend the Reich's last breath. They did not stare at the prisoners as enemies. They stared with a familiarity that suggested the war existed somewhere far from this place. To Strelitz, this lack of hatred was unsettling. Hostility would have made sense. Indifference felt like something far more destabilizing. The library was housed in a low wooden building at the center of the camp, its shelves lined with books in both German and English. Newspapers arrived regularly, and men gathered in small clusters to read them aloud, absorbing news of cities destroyed, of surrenders and final offensives. Some of the officers found themselves reading American newspapers, studying the tone of political debates, the advertisements for radios and automobiles, the calm reporting of events. A world existed beyond the scorched continent they had left behind, a world that continued building rather than destroying. Volkmann spent his evenings in the library, tracing maps and atlases, comparing borders as they had been drawn before the war to the way they were being drawn now. Each shift in a line felt like the closing of a story he had once believed he was writing. Music filtered through the camp on weekends. Some prisoners had brought instruments. Others crafted new ones from scrap lumber and salvaged wire. An orchestra formed, small but skilled, and their rehearsals became an event that drew both prisoners and guards to the yard. Violins played old German folk songs, marches, and eventually softer melodies that had nothing to do with military pride. When the music rose, the camp felt momentarily unguarded, as though memory itself was performing. Strelitz stood at the edge of these gatherings listening. He felt the music not as comfort but as a reminder of the life he had led before the war demanded every breath of him. Volkmann sometimes closed his eyes during the music, imagining a sky free of bombers and searchlights. There was peace here, but it was not gentle. It forced reflection. Yet under this quiet routine lived currents of tension. Not every prisoner accepted the camp's conditions with gratitude or curiosity. Some viewed the comforts as a trap designed to soften loyalty. There were officers who still spoke of honor and surrender resisted internally, of the fatherland rising again if only its defenders remained pure. They gathered at night whispering in corners of the barracks, reinforcing the belief that resignation was betrayal. Strelitz heard fragments of these conversations, references to traitors, to weak-minded officers who would return home unfit to face their own people. The words were hushed but sharp. One afternoon, Volkmann sat with a group discussing the news of Germany's collapse. A young infantry lieutenant insisted the American kindness was manipulation, designed to reshape them. "They want us to forget who we are," the young man said. Volkmann responded softly. If a man's identity can be undone by a meal in a book, perhaps he never understood it to begin with. The officer stared at him, his jaw tight. No one spoke for several seconds. The moment passed, but its echo lingered. Volkmann felt Strelitz watching him later, a silent question in his gaze. What are we becoming? In the evenings, the prairie sky flared in deep gold before fading to violet. The camp settled into a stillness that was neither safety nor captivity, but something suspended between. Men walked the perimeter fence not as though planning escape, but simply because movement kept their thoughts from tightening into knots. Strelitz walked there too, hands behind his back, eyes on a horizon that did not belong to him. Freedom was visible, tangible, and yet unreachable. The contradiction carved itself into him day by day. One night, as darkness settled fully, a distant voice carried across the barracks, raised, angry, cut short abruptly. A door slammed. Silence followed, heavy and unnatural. No one asked what had happened. But every man who heard it understood. The peace within these fences was a surface. Beneath it, loyalties, fears, and old beliefs were shifting. Something was beginning to fracture. And soon it would break. Night in the camp did not bring peace. It only softened the boundaries between what was spoken aloud and what was kept hidden. After lights out, the barracks filled with the muted rustle of men settling into their bunks. But beneath that lay another current. Whispers sharp enough to draw blood. German officers who still clung to the ideology that had fueled the war gathered quietly, their words low and urgent. They spoke of honor, of betrayal, of the duty to remain loyal to a nation now collapsing. They used phrases like true Germans and steadfast men, as though the walls themselves were listening. And in a sense they were. The walls had ears because fear traveled faster than sound. General Wilhelm Strelitz felt that tension each night, a pressure that seemed to linger along the rafters. The camp had begun to change. It was no longer simply a place of unexpected comfort. It was a proving ground of the mind. What a man believed in Germany was not what he believed here, because here the world was different. Calm, orderly, strangely humane. That contrast was as dangerous as any battlefield. For some prisoners, the idea that the enemy could be decent threatened to unravel the worldview that had justified so much destruction. The factions developed gradually. On one side were those who began to question whether the war had ever been winnable, whether the sacrifices demanded of them had meaning. Men like Colonel Ernst Volkmann found themselves drawn into quiet conversations about rebuilding, about the possibility of a Germany that might live without perpetual struggle. These talks were cautious, spoken in corners of the yard or in the library where pages turning masked quiet doubts. On the other side were the loyalists. Among them, Captain Rudolf Mertens emerged as a figure of authority. He was younger than Strelitz, but his voice carried an intensity that bordered on fervor. His faith in the Reich remained intact, unbroken even by defeat. To him, the camp's comforts were a calculated seduction. He claimed that the Americans sought to weaken their resolve, to transform German officers into men ashamed of the very nation they had sworn to defend. He moved through the barracks like an unseen current, gathering followers one conversation at a time. Mertens confronted Volkmann one evening outside the mess hall as the sky darkened to indigo. They stood alone, the air still warm with lingering sunlight. "You speak too freely," Mertens said softly, though his words carried weight. Volkmann met his gaze without flinching. "I speak only of what I see." Mertens stepped closer. "Then see more carefully. There are ears here that listen for weakness." The threat was gentle, almost polite, and that made it far more dangerous. Strelitz watched these divisions with a growing prayer. Beyond the fence, the prairie wind carried no judgment, only patience, as if waiting to see what kind of men would emerge from the dust of everything they once thought unbreakable. When the gates finally opened, it was not triumph that greeted the prisoners, but uncertainty. Trains once again carried them, but this time the movement felt directionless. German landscapes that had once been familiar were transformed into expanses of shattered brick and scorched earth. Cities that had been symbols of culture and ancestry were now reduced to skeletal outlines, their windows empty, their streets silent, except for the wind and the slow, exhausted footsteps of those returning. General Wilhelm Strelitz stepped off the train into a Germany that did not seem to recognize him. The air smelled not of industry or farmland, but of ash, damp stone, and the lingering smoke of fires that had burned too long. He felt as though he had returned not to the nation he served, but to the aftermath of a story told without him. His home no longer stood. Where the house once rested beneath a line of tall trees, there was only rubble and an abandoned well choked with debris. Neighbors had scattered or died. The familiar streets were gone, replaced by paths carved by desperate footsteps. Strelitz stood for a long time among the ruins, his boots sinking into the blackened soil. There was no anger in him, only a slow, heavy realization that everything he believed his service had preserved had vanished. Duty, discipline, sacrifice. They had all been offered to the war, and the war had devoured them without leaving meaning behind. Colonel Ernst Volkmann returned to his family in a small town spared the worst of the destruction. Though the war lingered there in quieter ways, children carried hunger in their faces. Adults spoke in hushed tones about futures they could not imagine. Volkmann walked through his home with the uneasy feeling of a man who had stepped into a life he had once known, but no longer inhabited. His wife embraced him with relief and sorrow tangled together, but the warmth did not erase the fracture in him. He found himself speaking less, listening more, and studying every conversation, as though searching for a language he used to understand. The camp in America did not leave him with comfort. It left him with questions that followed him into every silent room. Meanwhile, those who had clung fiercely to ideology found themselves confronted with a world that did not reflect their certainty. Captain Rudolf Mertens returned to a Germany without banners, without proclamations of destiny, without the thunder of marching boots. He looked for the cause he had defended and found only wreckage, yet he did not release his belief. Instead, he carried it like a hidden flame, protecting it from a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. He gathered with men who felt the same, speaking in low voices in abandoned cellars and damaged taverns. But where once their words had sounded like confidence, now they sounded like echoes trying to convince themselves of substance. The war had ended, but its grip had not. In the months following repatriation, rumors began to circulate among returning officers about the American camps, about their conditions, their structure, their strange decency. Some men admitted the truth without hesitation. They had been treated humanely, fed adequately, even given opportunities to study or work without humiliation. Others spoke of it reluctantly, fearing judgment. A few denied the reality entirely, insisting that memory had played tricks on them. But what spread quietly beneath the surface was the realization that the enemy had shown them a world in which dignity was not conditional. That realization held power. Strelitz found work cataloging inventory for a rebuilding committee, handling crates of supplies sent by foreign relief organizations. Each item he wrote into the records carried a reminder of dependence, the same dependence Germany had once insisted it would never need. He did not speak much, but when he did, he spoke with a measured calm that others noticed. Men asked his advice, not being heaviness. He had never considered himself ideological. He had served out of duty, structure, and the belief that wars were decided by discipline. Yet now discipline had turned inward. The lines being drawn were no longer between nations, but between men who had once fought side by side. And he who had once led thousands found himself unable to command even the direction of his own thoughts. The Americans noticed the tensions. They saw the subtle separations, which tables men chose in the mess hall, who lingered with whom, how quiet laughter ceased when certain officers entered a room. The guards did not intervene immediately. Their approach was observational, measured. Information mattered more than confrontation. A few prisoners were transferred to separate camps, but this only heightened suspicion. Rumors grew like roots in darkness. One night the camp shook with a single sudden sound, the crash of a metal cup striking the floor followed by raised voices. A gathering in Barracks 12 had turned into an argument. A man had been accused of speaking against the Reich. The confrontation escalated, and by the time guards arrived, the accused officer lay bruised, gasping, insisting he had said nothing disloyal. No charges were filed. No one confessed. But every prisoner understood what had happened. Violence now existed within the wire, not from outside it. The next day, the yard was quieter. Men spoke carefully. Even the soccer game seemed slower, movements deliberate rather than free. Volkmann walked the perimeter fence alone, his hands clasped behind his back. Strelitz joined him after a moment, their footsteps falling into rhythm. "It is beginning," Strelitz said. Volkmann nodded. "Belief does not die when armies do. It clings because without it we must face what we supported." Strelitz looked at him, realizing that the colonel had already come to conclusions he himself had only begun to approach. Days passed, and the ideological divide sharpened. Books borrowed from the library were not just read. They were interpreted, debated, feared. Newspapers became battlegrounds of meaning rather than fact. Some officers refused to read them altogether, claiming they were propaganda designed to bleed loyalty. Others read them obsessively, searching for something that could explain the vast distance between the Germany in their memories and the Germany now described in dispatches. The Americans organized discussion groups, claiming they were voluntary. They screened films that depicted democratic governance, civic life, citizens participating rather than obeying. Mertens refused to attend, calling them indoctrination. Folkman went once and remained silent the entire time, though afterward his expression carried a thoughtful, unsettled shadow. Strelitz did not attend at all. He did not yet trust himself to listen. Late one evening, a letter arrived for Strelitz. Mail from Germany was rare and often delayed for weeks. He opened it alone, sitting on the barracks' wooden steps under a sky spangled with stars. The letter was from his wife. Her words were brief. Their home had been destroyed. Food was scarce. His town no longer resembled the place they had once built a life. She did not ask when he would return. She asked whether he believed he still could. Strelitz folded the letter carefully. He felt the night settle around him warm and silent. The question was not about geography. It was about the man who would return if he returned at all. The war had taken his certainty. The camp, in its quiet and order, had taken the simplicity of belief. He wondered whether identity could survive captivity, not of the body, but of reflection. Inside Barracks 12, voices whispered again, rehearsing loyalty like because he commanded them, but because he seemed to see past the debris to something still living beneath it. Yet even as he offered steady words, he wrestled with his own displacement. What does a soldier do when the battle ends, but the question of what it meant remains unanswered? Folkman joined efforts to restore a local school, repairing desks and clearing debris from hallways where children's voices had once echoed. Teaching replaced commanding. He discovered that the act of explaining a concept, of guiding understanding rather than enforcing obedience, required a gentleness he had not known he possessed. The war had carved silence into him, but the classroom began to soften it. Still, at night, he walked outside to look at the sky, searching for the planes he once guided. He did not miss the war. He missed the certainty of purpose that had disguised itself as duty. Mertens, however, grew restless. He claimed that Germany's downfall had not been inevitable. It had been sabotage, weakness, betrayal. He saw the humanitarian aid, the rebuilding plans, the political reorganization, as foreign manipulation disguised as mercy. To him, the comfort in the camps had been the first strike in a war for identity rather than territory. He warned that the enemy had not defeated Germany on the battlefield, but sought to defeat it in memory. His voice did not attract crowds, only small gatherings. But small gatherings in fractured times were seeds. The years passed. Germany rebuilt, unevenly, painfully, with scars that never fully closed. The men who had once stood behind barbed wire carried the camps with them in different ways. For some, the experience planted the first quiet thought that strength need not demand cruelty. For others, it strengthened resentment against a world they believed had abandoned them. And for most, it left a tension that lived beneath the surface of ordinary days. A war that did not end simply because the guns had. One evening, as autumn settled across the town where Folkman taught, Strelitz visited him. The two men walked through streets lined with the beginnings of new life. Children played among buildings still missing windows. Market stalls opened in squares still bearing cracks. Everything was fragile, but it existed. Strelitz paused beside a fountain that had been repaired with mismatched stone. "We returned," he said quietly, "but not as the men who left." Folkman nodded. "War changes nations," he replied, "but captivity changes souls." They stood in silence, the night gentle around them. Somewhere in a tavern lit by dim lamps, Mertens spoke to a small audience, his voice urgent, insisting that Germany must reclaim the identity he believed was stolen. And across a distant ocean, the camp still stood quiet now, its fences empty, the wind moving through it unchallenged. The question remained, unspoken but present. What happens to a nation when its enemies teach some of its soldiers how to live, and others how to refuse to change? The answer was still unfolding.